Let's talk today about adding details to colored pencil drawings. I would say the vast majority of the drawings that I've created that have wow factor do have a good amount of fine details, but that can seem quite overwhelming if you're not sure where to start. So I'll show you the process that I use for adding in fine details. And I think it will help to show you whilst I'm drawing this bonsai tree. Now, this bonsai tree is an amazing example of all the details that can be added to colored pencil drawings. It's got so many little needle leaves and branches in the background that make up this drawing. So we'll generally talk you through this drawing. Before we do that, let's just talk about the most important material that you need for adding in details, and that is a decent pencil sharpener. It's not going to be possible to add in all of the details that you can see on this picture if you don't have a really nice and sharp pencil. You're not going to be able to create the very small thin lines that are needed. So I use something called a swordfish icon pencil sharpener. I particularly like this sharpener because I can change the blade when it gets blunt. That said, to be honest, you can make very good sharp pencils on much cheaper sharpeners as well, like this for example. I also want to stress how important it is to have the right kind of paper to build up all of the colored pencil. Ultimately, the key to creating details with colored pencil is building up the drawing in a series of layers, and you need to have paper that can take all of those layers. I like drawing on a smooth Bristol board paper. This is a really thick paper. It's almost like a sheet of cards, and it's these layers of pencil that is again going to form all of this detail. Now, the last thing that I particularly want you to bear in mind before we get to this drawing is the level of detail that realistically you should actually add. I know that some artists spend 30 plus hours creating drawings. That's not something I personally do. I don't need to spend that long adding in that amount of detail. I do think that I could probably add in more details than I generally do on my drawings, but I always think it's important to remember the viewing distance that you expect people to be at. So with this bonsai tree, for example, I don't expect people to be looking at it this far away from their face. And there's no point in me adding in all of the details for someone viewing it that close. So I think something to bear in mind is actually when adding in details, don't spend ages adding in details that no one's going to see. Now, this will probably make a lot more sense when we complete this drawing. Now, before we get started with the drawing, if you do want to go through this with me in a lot more detail, I do have a full tutorial available. In fact, I have loads of tutorials in a whole host of different subjects. And I have a good mixture of faster, simple drawings, as well as a lot more detailed drawings like this. For every drawing, I include really in-depth instructions, all of the real-time footage, details of all of the colors that I use, the sketch outlines, and the reference photo. And I have not only colored pencil drawings, but also graphite and watercolor pencil. Check out the link in the description. So let's work through building up some of these details on this tree. So I always start a very detailed drawing like this in exactly the same way as I would any other drawing. I want to start off by literally blocking in the colors, the lightest color in each area. And I'm not focusing on adding in any details while I'm doing this. I want to try and get the pencil down as lightly and smoothly as possible. And there's a few ways that I can do this. First up, you'll notice that I'm holding the pencil much further back than you might expect. I'm not holding it really close to the tip, and this literally stops me from being able to press too hard. I'm also trying to get this down as smoothly as I can, so I'm working in kind of circular motions rather than just scribbling back and forth. And all I'm doing initially here for this tree is putting this green down in any kind of patches of the green. So I'm looking at the overall underlying color and blocking this in. This is literally all I want to do to start with. You'll notice that not a single detail is being added in this initial stage. But I do want to work out where all these details are going to go, and this is very important for me to kind of get my bearings. So I'm adding this light green in all of the light green areas, and I can add this kind of reddish brown, just really nice and lightly in any areas where the branches will be. If I didn't start off by putting this underlying color down and working out what's going where, not only do I think it would be a lot harder because I wouldn't know what's going in each area, but it would end up looking a lot scratchier because you'd be able to see the white paper very clearly through behind it. So you'll see for this first section, it looks a little bit kind of cartoony, and that's okay. Do note while I'm building up these light layers that I do still have a very sharp pencil. Even though I'm not adding in all of the tiny details at this point, I always want to have a sharp pencil. So once I've got those initial shapes mapped in, let's start adding in some details. And I find it easiest to focus on just half of the tree at a time. So in this section, for now, I'm only going to focus on the top half of the tree. And what I'm going to do is just break this down into small sections. I think adding in details can seem extremely overwhelming. So what I've done is I've selected the next darkest color I can see within all of the needle leaves. So there's this kind of earthy mid-tone green, I would say. And I am literally looking at one of the spines or branches at a time. And what I want to do is add in all of these little spines. So I'm still working with a nice and sharp pencil, and I am taking it away and frequently sharpening it. I'm lightly brushing my pencil against the paper to create light flicks, specifically going in the direction I can see on each leaf. And this is where it's really helpful that I have already mapped in those underlying kind of base layers, because I have a little bit of an idea on what's going where. If I was just going ahead adding in these flicking motions before I'd added anything else onto the paper, it would be really difficult to know where it's going. Now, this is probably the most time-consuming part of this whole drawing, is building up all of these little flicks, particularly focusing on going in those correct directions. And it's also looking a little bit odd. I think it's all looking quite wiry at this point, but that's okay. This is very much a case that we've just got to work through the process of gradually building up the texture and the details. There is so many details to add here. It is going to take some patience. So you'll see I'm generally working from the left towards the right, and it's not looking very rich. I don't expect it to look very rich at this point because it's literally just one color. But this is very much going to give the full foundation that I'm going to be able to add other details onto the top. So by the time that I've gone through and marked in everything with this first lightest green, what I then want to do is gradually work from the lighter colors towards the darker colors. So this is a similar green, but a darker green. I would say it's a darker mid-tone. And what I'm doing is adding flicking motions over the top of the flicking motions I've already added, which is anywhere that's this color or darker. So you can see I'm going through this still with a nice and sharp pencil. And it's still not looking amazing, but it is starting to add that little extra bit of detail. So let's keep working from these lighter colors towards the darker colors. And I can move on now to a brown. This is actually the same brown that I used for the base layer on the stems. Again, working with flicking motions anywhere where I can see this brown or darker. And then I can move on to an even darker brown. Again, following that same process. So you'll see quite quickly the key to adding in all of the details of this tree is building the colors one on top of each other, but also building up all of the, in this case, texture that I can see on the tree. It just wouldn't be possible to add in this amount of detail and texture without building the colors on top of each other. And you can see quite quickly, actually, we are getting some sort of level of detail. I do think it's looking a bit scratchy, but that's okay. The thing I really want to focus on here is getting the contrast looking correct. So it's pretty much the case with all colored pencil drawings. If you get the contrast right, get those lights and darks mapped in correctly, it doesn't massively matter as much, either the colors that you're using or to a degree the level of detail that there is. So I really want to focus on getting these darkest areas marked in for now with this darker brown. So now on that kind of vein, let's move on now to the black pencil to add in those absolute darkest areas. And you'll see that here I've kind of moved on from creating flicking motions, and I'm more using circular motions to just block in that color, just make what I've got here a little bit darker. So once I'm happy with the black areas, let's smooth things out a little bit. So at this point, before I move on here, I think the whole thing looks very scratchy. It doesn't look quite right. And although I want to have details, I do find if you don't go over the top of them, they do just look very wiry. So you'll see here I'm using circular motions like I did for those original base layers. This is with that slightly darker green to just smooth things out a little bit. I want to go over everything pretty much that I've got here, just again trying to focus a bit more on the contrast. That absolutely needs to be my focus here, and then I can always add in some final little details later. So I'm just going to tweak the colors in a few areas to tweak the stems and all of the branches, make them a little bit darker, a bit richer. It looks a bit odd, I would say, next to the green now. And generally just smooth things out a little bit more with this bright green as well. And then let's build up some of the texture and color on the bottom area as well. So I'm going to go through this a bit faster. I once again want to be working from the lighter colors towards the darker colors and generally mapping in the main shapes that I can see here. I wouldn't say there's as much texture in this bottom area. There's a little bit of kind of fuzzy moss, which I have created with some little flicks in exactly the same way as I did for the branches at the top. But on the most part, I'm again just trying to make the contrast look right. And quite quickly, I am left with something that does look reasonably detailed. It doesn't look finished. It doesn't have that wow factor to it yet. But I do have a textured tree marked in here. At this point, I find it easier now to start working on the drawing as a whole, rather than working on the top section and the bottom section separately. And generally speaking, I'm going to work from the darker colors gradually towards the lighter colors. So you can see here I'm working with the black pencil and I'm focusing on getting the darkest areas marked in to look as dark as they are. So I can go over the whole of the tree trunk, adding in all of this depth and working around some of the lighter areas that you can see down the bottom here. And I'm going to work my way from those darker colors towards the lighter colors. So going over that black, which I do think can look quite harsh, I'm putting this dark brown and it's kind of mixing together to create a really dark brown. And you can see how adding in all of that shading on this bottom area creates what looks like a load of details when really it is mostly contrast, I would say. So I can work towards the darker green here, really again building up that contrast. In some areas I am adding some texture, but on the most part I'm building up with circular motions still, with my goal being to smooth everything out. I can use a kind of mid-tone pencil to just add in a few extra details, which I think it's much easier to see where these need to go at this point because all of that contrast is built up. Just adding a few flicks along the moss on the side here is really doing a lot for this drawing. And then let's do exactly the same thing at the top. So again, starting with the darker color, so the black here, filling in all of the darkest areas with this color before moving on to the very dark brown, really focusing on making the contrast darker, although you will see that I'm working in flicking motions here. Starting now from this right hand side and I'm working towards the left and I'm building up further all of that detail that I added towards the beginning. So once again with a nice and sharp pencil, creating mostly flicking motions to blend into the surrounding areas so that I don't have as harsh lines. And I can gradually work towards the lighter colors, so still adding in these flicking motions but with that darker green. And then I can start working my way towards the lighter colors. And then all that's left is to add some final tweaks, fill in some final areas with again the circular motions to smooth everything out. And then I am left with a really nice and detailed tree. So I would say the key to building up details is to build up a lot of layers of color, but do focus on what can reasonably be seen from a normal viewing distance. There's no point in adding in so many details onto, with this tree, all of those individual needles really precisely if no one's going to see it. Now do remember, if you want to go through this bonsai tree with me in a lot more detail, I do have a full tutorial. And if you want to see how I recommend leveling up your drawings, check out this video here. This contains some absolutely amazing tips to improve your drawings fast. Happy drawing, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.